All right, it's another edition of the Marquette Show, and I am coming to you from Costa Rica. So I'm here with Brian Koehn of Brian. What's the name of your organization?
Social purpose corrections.
Social Purpose Corrections, and you are a former prison warden. And for those who are longtime listeners of my content, they're probably going to be surprised. Mark's talking to a prison warden, but I really think that prisons are a necessary part of a civilized society. And I think that in many cases, too many people are in them, people that shouldn't be in them, and that prisons in many cases are sort of counterproductive to their own ends. But that's kind of what your whole thing is, Brian. You have left the government prison model. You have,
To have the conversation. I appreciate the time with you and your listeners. Yeah, I did a long career, 28 years in private corrections. So I actually,
was it private? Okay, my mistake.
yeah, I worked for the for-profit companies, warden at 5 facilities, head of security 65 facilities. But I was really tired of the outcomes. As a taxpayer, as a corrections professional, as a human being, we're quite frank with you, on how we, in many ways, intentionally recycle human beings and really not give them the fair chance. And when people talk to me, they said, well, is the correction system broken? And my response to that is, well, really no, because it's designed to warehouse human beings and it does a really good job of that. Um, is the system designed to reduce crime? Is the system designed to help human beings? Is the system designed to reduce the cost? Absolutely not. The outcomes of U.S. corrections as a whole is abysmal. I mean, I don't think there's a single outcome that's positive that comes out of the correction system. But as the taxpayer, I mean, in most states, it's the number two or number three largest line item. But how often do you hear anybody talk about it? You don't.
Right. So when it comes to government systems, I wouldn't even venture a guess between which is better between private and government, to be honest. I mean, I think that they probably have their advantages in either direction, but as far as coming up with a quantified better, I'm not prepared to say that. I can say that government systems in other countries seem to have better results, seem to have the sort of results that people actually want to have from prisons. Results like less crime committed by the people who get out. I mean, that's probably the number one thing. And I think in many cases, sort of the leftists have abandoned the notion that we're going to, somehow solve problems with prisons. Maybe in like the 60s and 70s, this was their idea. But I think these days it's just like they don't even think about prison, other than death penalty bad and a few other sort of simple thought process, and black people don't get a fair shake. I think those are sort of their main thoughts. And the righties in many cases, I wonder whether they ever wanted good results out of prisons, but they certainly aren't expecting them. And I would consider myself sort of on the right, but I have personal experience, having been in prison myself, that you know there's a lot of people in there. A lot of them can be better people when they get out. And I think that that's the result. Most of them are going to get out. And I think we all want the ones who get out to not commit more crimes. So that's the fundamental thing that we're sort of looking at here. Tell me this model. I was very excited when you started talking to me about this. So tell me your model and what your ideas are.
Yeah, well, thank you. The model was born out of frustration, first of all, and faith, to be quite frank with you. Private prisons within the United States are 8% of the beds. So it's a sliver of the problem within the United States are run by for-profit companies. And the contract model in private prisons is two fronts. Number one, it's heads and beds based. So they are compensated to manage incarcerated people by the numbers of people incarcerated. And so there's perverse incentive there. I mean, if private business is engaged in a traditionally government function, well, like corrections, they should bring value to the outcomes. In many ways, the government requires the private prisons to run corrections their way, well, only cheaper. Well, their way is part of the problem, and so coming from, as a warden in private corrections, which is a little different than government corrections, I had the same responsibility as a government corrections warden, but I also was a CEO of a business. I had to generate an EBITDA, a revenue, and a profit for the for-profit company. And in that process, you're required to think about the problem differently. Because, as an example, violence. Violence is expensive. I mean, there's studies out there, $18,000 for each violent incident. I mean, it's expensive. So your ability to reduce violence within a private prison equals better return. And so just as an example, you're required, plus in private prisons, you're accountable to your facilities at a much higher level than a government person would be. But in that process, you are required through a business mindset, per se, to understand the root cause. And because you can't fix violence if you fix symptoms. Symptoms might solve one or two of the problems, but you're not going to solve the root cause of the fact that we put too many gang members in one pod and not enough of another in another pod. And so as you better understand the root cause of the problem, I better understood the dysfunction of our country. I served in the Marine Corps. I'm very proud of the United States. I fought once. I'm fighting today for us. And the fight today is on corrections and outcomes. And so when you look at the recidivism rate, for your listeners, the number one challenge we have in corrections today starts with correctional officer retention. There's not enough security. They can't hire enough. No security, no programming, no recreation, no contact visits, bad recidivism. Cause and effect.
Say them all again, because I don't think people really necessarily understand. So, having more prison guards, most prison guards are looking for a job in their local sheriff department or police department, right? So they, go to work as a prison guard for a short period of time until they can get upgraded to this other line of work. And then what are the results?
Well, when you're short security, the foundation, the core principle of correction starts with public safety. The courts, they're adjudicated, they go through the process, they're convicted. The courts say you get X amount of time, whether it's truth in sentencing, it's whatever that state has as far as the sentencing requirements. Corrections just takes the people that are given to them from the courts. But the crisis in the country today is based off of correctional officer turnover. And so if you have 300 officers inside this facility and you have 50% vacancies, now the existing officers that were there have to do double the work in order to make sure that place is safe and secure, which is the number one priority. Accountability is part of the purpose of corrections. But the reality is if you don't have enough security, you can't do programs, you can't do education, you can't do contact visits, you don't do recreation. The problem is now the things that are designed to help human beings, and just to be frank, there's not enough of it. There wasn't enough of it in the first place before there was a correctional officer crisis. But now with the correctional officer crisis, you don't have enough security. You pull those people that you do have into the critical security posts, because really that is your number one purpose. Don't let people out until it's their time to leave.
Custody, care, and control.
There we go. And so until you bring purpose to that job, and as the warden, I was looking at the problem, not necessarily privates per se, because every prison I ran in privates was significantly more humane than the government counterpart. People don't want to hear that sometimes, but that is the reality. And so I'm looking at these outcomes of recidivism, of violence, and I'm looking at the people that are incarcerated, and the majority of them, by a long shot, are good people that made poor choices. They're not the front page news folks. No, there are some out there that need to be in prison and stay there for the rest of their life. But that's not the majority of people that are incarcerated. 95% are getting out. The lifespan of a correctional officer is 59 years old. The job kills people. And Mark, yours is 76 years right now, I think, for men in the United States, 80 for women. Correctional officer, 59. The suicide rate for occupation-wise, correctional officers at the top. Divorce rate, correctional officers is at the top. You get the theme. It's a toxic environment.
It really stinks. There were really good people who I worked with when I worked in prison. And, I mourn their deaths because for whatever reason, just alcoholism and suicide, these things seem to plague correctional officers at a higher rate than most.
And think about the incarcerated. If it's that hard on the staff, think how hard it is when every day you're on high alert, making sure somebody doesn't hurt you or doesn't have a shank or, while you're walking around prison. Then you get the races do their own little thing, and each race has their own leaders within that race. And then you kind of have to listen to them or you won't get their protection. It's just a very problematic, dynamic world of dysfunction. And I'm sitting back going, we got to change this. This is not acceptable. Not acceptable as a human being, not acceptable as a Christian, not acceptable as a taxpayer, not acceptable as a Marine, not acceptable, period. I was used as a fixer of prisons. I was a warden at 5 different facilities with 16 different jurisdictions. And so I had a unique way of looking at the problem. A lot of it was through business sense, and changing the outcomes, even when we were required to follow the government policies as far as how we operate the facilities. And so, what if there was a nonprofit who, number one, we weren't motivated by feeding Wall Street, and I'm an entrepreneur, and I'm not saying that's definitely wrong, but I am saying in corrections, if that's the motivation, that's perverse motivation. It's not healthy.
Yep. I think the number one problem that private prisons have is that they get paid by heads and beds, as you said, and when it comes down to that, that means their incentive is to keep somebody who otherwise would be able to go out into society in prison. There's many people. My business partner currently, I cannot justify in my mind, even if I thought that he was guilty, I do not consider him a danger to society. To me, prison is a good place to put people who are a danger to society. It physically separates them from others. And then maybe they can learn. Certainly we would have programs for people who are violent towards each other and things like that. Maybe we can teach some of them to not be violent. And, I'll get into that in a little while. But I can see also putting a chronic thief, somebody who just keeps on stealing and doesn't pay anybody back, even though he's sentenced to pay people back, and these kind of things. I can see putting him in a sort of forced labor situation. I wouldn't put him in with the violent people necessarily, but a place where it's like, look, you're going to work, you're going to earn money, you're going to give that money to the people you ripped off, and then when you're done paying it off, plus the punitive damages, then you can go free. And then hopefully you will have learned that there's more work in stealing. The crime doesn't pay, as Batman used to say. and, and then there's the sex offenders, which I think probably need a whole different set of counseling than the violent people do. I'm not an expert. I don't propose to be one. And then there's the people who do drugs and then cause harm in the process. So I'm thinking of drunk drivers as my number one example. There's very few of them within prison, but these people, they have a problem, and they certainly harmed people, and maybe prison's, the right sort of punishment. Maybe it's not, I don't know. But I think that we way underuse house arrest and probation and a variety of these things. I think those are administered poorly too, because they're administered by the government. But there's still options. We just don't use them, and we don't get them right. So this is a new option. Tell me what it is your idea is for this sort of not-for-profit prison.
Well, our idea is to bring a bit of disruption and innovation to the correction space. We are a nonprofit. We're the first in the country, in the U.S., the fourth in the world, that has the vision of operate prisons as a nonprofit. Now, we won't have ability to affect sentences because that's dictated by the courts, but we can bring humanity to the solution. Number one, bring purpose to the job. Correctional officers should come to work. I mean, is there a better field? Maybe education, but is there a better field to help human beings than corrections? It's the end of the road. It's the melting pot of our society's dysfunction. It's homelessness, it's inequality, it's poverty, it's mental health hospitals. It's where people with addictions go that they can't treat. And accountability is important to change. And, to your point earlier, I think measured accountability is important. But in many ways, the way the sentencing guidelines, truth in sentencing is set up, the judges are completely, hands are tied. They have no choices but to give these long sentences. And that's part of changing the system, not the part that we're specifically focusing on. Our part is to how do we change the outcomes of corrections and actually help human beings while they're incarcerated, to help them live a tax-paying, family-generated, faithful life. And there's ways to do that within, and challenging the current assumptions in the current system. A lot of the stuff I learned while in privates and, questioning why we did things and understanding root cause.
I feel like the number one thing we can teach people is that bad action, malbehavior, however you want to describe this sort of action, sin, if you want to use that term. I think that that's really fundamentally what the Bible was talking about, is that this behavior that has negative results is bad behavior, right? and there's the sort of easy ones like wrath, right? And violence, and these sorts of things. When you realize that cause, effect, once you get it down that this is the idea, then, well, a lot of people think they're going to be able to game the system. Well, if only this one time I do this thing, I'll be able to get over enough that I'll be able to, be better here. And it doesn't work. And if I can speak to the convicts right now, you're not sitting in there because you're smart enough to game the system. Like, if you were smart enough to game the system, you would have been elected a politician a long time ago. And those are the only ones, from what I can tell, that can do it. And obviously, I'm being somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but at the same time, yeah, it seems like the successful criminals go into politics and the unsuccessful ones go to prison.
Well, I think, again, looking at root cause, if you look at who we incarcerate in the United States, it's the poor of our society, without exception. It's disproportionately black, brown, and poor whites, to be quite frank with it. That's who's incarcerated. So you look, poverty is an indicator of incarceration. Desperate people make desperate choices. Now, I don't say that to excuse. There's lots of people from those same communities who don't cause crime. But the reality is, if they continue to have their addiction, if they continue to struggle with their mental health challenges, we release people out of prison with $50 in a bus ticket, and then we're surprised when they create a new victim and a new crime. They can't even get a place to sleep and food. Desperate people make desperate choices, and there's ways while they're incarcerated, we can prepare them better for release with housing and with jobs, mental health and continuity of care upon release, those kinds of things that can be done while they're incarcerated.
Explain those ways in more detail.
Well, traditionally, corrections in our country, whether it's prisons, which is more my experience, or jails, the responsibility for housing and jobs falls on some kind of community component, community corrections, probation, parole. I mean, there's different terms for it, halfway houses, those kinds of things. And so corrections is typically designed to get you an education and treat your addictions and your mental health issues while you're incarcerated. The corrections does not focus on jobs and housing, as an example, or continuity of care. If I'm on a psychotropic medication because I need to be, and I'm released with 7 days of medication, but I have no way to follow up on that, what do you think happens after 7 days? They go off the medications and they make some really bad choices. The same thing is if they leave with $50 in a bus ticket. I mean, what do you expect them to do? And I say this not to excuse crime, because you shouldn't hurt people. But the reality is if they don't have a job and a place to sleep. I know a state right now that releases people out of prison to the city park with a tent in it and a sleeping bag. Today.
Yeah. So, they were in a bad place. They were treated badly by, in some cases, bad people. They were housed with bad people, and, they ate bad food, and a whole bunch of bad things happened to them, and they did bad things. And then, suddenly this release date comes, and that'll teach them to behave well. And obviously, this system isn't working. Now, one thing you haven't touched on is, do you know what the recidivism rate is? Because I've heard numbers across the board from like 50%, which is quite good, to as high as 85%. Do you have any notion as to what these numbers are?
Well, first question I think that we need to ask is, what's the definition of recidivism? I think you will see that the majority of states right now are, to include some bigger systems, they're talking 15, 18% recidivism. I just kind of look sideways like, the last National Bureau of Justice Statistics study, which was years ago, had 2/3 recidivism. But their definition was a rearrest, not reincarcerate. So I think when you look at the definition of recidivism by agency, by department, by state, you have to look at how they're defining it. Because it's amazing how the national study can say, 71% recidivate within 3 years of being released, but then you got the state saying they're at 15 or 18%. And then when you look at, the definition with the state, like if a person leaves the state and commits a crime, well, that's not part of their recidivism numbers, because number one, they don't even know about it, and it's not tracked to them. So it's one of those terms that you hear that you could be really careful with, because what does it mean? And I can tell you that in some of these states, if recidivism was truly 15%, there would be a massive reduction in incarceration rates within that state. And you just don't see those things. I'm not a researcher, I'm an operator, but
Yep.
I apply common sense to their numbers, and I'm just like, well, this just doesn't add up, and so, so to your question, I usually go with the National Bureau of Justice Statistics numbers, which is, 71% at 3 years, I think 81% at 9 years, and that's rearrest again, that's not reincarcerate.
So, I sincerely hope that you are able to change these numbers in some way, shape, or form, and I really want to follow what it is you guys are doing. But I do have sort of some things that I want to discuss as a greater topic. There's the notion out there that, especially among conservatives like myself, that somehow the justice system is lax on people. That, there's the guy that slit the throat of the Ukrainian woman in North Carolina on a bus or a train. I couldn't exactly figure out what was going on there. And this guy had been arrested 30-something times, and apparently some of them were violent, clearly had mental health issues. And not that excuses any way, shape, or form. Many people believe that if somebody's declared insane, that somehow they don't give them a pat on the butt and send them back out to do more violence. I don't find this to be a common way to deal with insane people. Usually they're just incarcerated in a different manner. And I'm wondering, what do you think when you hear, as a correctional officer, warden, and your career, what do you think when you hear people say, the justice system's just too lax on these people?
A couple of thoughts, and that's an excellent question, by the way. Let's just be honest with your listeners. Hard on crime wins elections, without a doubt.
Yeah.
Nobody, whether you're Democrat, Republican, somewhere in the middle, nobody wins an election on soft on crime. Nobody.
Yep. And I don't think teaching people to behave better when they get out of prison is soft on crime.
Well, that's part of my point. In fact, I just got off a call because I'm in Arizona talking to legislators on that very issue. I prefer to start to change the narrative to go, instead of hard on crime, go smart on crime. Because the reality, hard on crime, lock people away, they did bad things, increase your sentences for, I think there's some legislation about giving life to 14-year-olds in a state right now. It's just like, it's the perception of society is, well, that makes sense to me. If we lock away all the bad people, when they're not really bad, but the bad people, and keep them locked up for X period of time, well, we won't have as much crime. Okay, well, if that logic was sound and worked, then we wouldn't have as many people in prison, and our prisons are full. And actually, after COVID, it had a significant drop, but you're seeing a trend back up again. So I try to educate, let's be smart about crime, and let's follow what the research tells us, what the evidence tells us. And in having a warehouse philosophy in the United States where they're really not getting programming or help with their mental health or help with their addiction or help with education, because education equals success. I mean, uneducated is almost 100% to recidivate. The higher level of education, the less chance they're going to come back. If we understand all of this, then why aren't we doing smart on crime and spending money and resources to help them while they're incarcerated? So when they get out with a job, with housing, with an education, with a mental health treatment plan, with stuff that helps them, they go home and take care of their families. But when we're releasing them, desperate people make desperate choices like we were talking about, which is counterproductive because it's fed by the hard on crime narrative that, you win elections by being hard on crime. Therefore, we need to be hard on crime. But it's terrible for crime because we're warehousing human beings and not getting them ready to be out. So I prefer, in every chance I get, I talk to people, let's be smart on crime. Let's follow what the evidence tells us. To your point earlier, there's people in prison that don't need to be there. They're not a risk to society. But the sentencing guidelines, the truth in sentencing requirements requires the judge to give them a certain amount of time based off that offense, and they don't have any discretion ability. Well, I know a gentleman that's doing 20 years in Arizona for selling marijuana. He's been incarcerated for, I think, 10 plus years. His daughter, because they changed the laws in Arizona, so now it's legal to sell it. His daughter owns a marijuana dispensary company and drives a Bentley. And his father, who did the same thing, 10, 15 years earlier, is doing 20 years of time. And he's still doing 20 years of time. That the disparity there, and they can't get him out because because he was sentenced on truth in sentencing, and he's going to do 85% of that sentence, whatever that happens to be. I don't have all the details, but it's just a kind of a unique example. The daughter did the exact same thing legally, selling marijuana, as the father did, but the father's doing 20 years because of it, because he was distributing it, and not using it. And we have to educate the voters that hard on crime, the term hard on crime, not accountability, that's important, but to win an election based off of increasing restrictions, putting more people in prison and putting them in there for longer periods of time is counterproductive to reducing victims. And really, that's the end goal, right? Is less victims, stop the harm. But smart on crime, if we use the evidence out there, and there's a lot of it, what works? Let's educate them while they're incarcerated. Let's help them with jobs and housing while they're incarcerated before they leave. Let's help them with their mental health. And that's a pie in the sky because all those things are complicated, each on their own merit. But the reality is, if we don't start investing in corrections to help human beings, Arizona, $1.7 billion budget, 35,000 people incarcerated. As a taxpayer, what do we get for that? We're just dumping it. We're getting warehousing.
The taxpayer or anything like that. In fact, it's counterproductive to the taxpayer's goals.
You look at any of the governor's elections this year, how many of them actually have corrections on their platform issue?
They don't need to. I mean, at this point, the corrections has been milked to the point that there's really nothing that they can do. I mean, the places where, anyway, I have one more question that I want to milk on this one. I think that we could solve much of corrections by ending the war on drugs, or at least smartening the war on drugs in a variety of ways. However, I want to talk about this segment of people that I think are probably the most important when we talk about rehabilitation and crime and these sorts of things, violent offenders. So I saw a statistic online, take this for what it's worth, but I do kind of believe it as somebody who's, got more than a passing interest in education in this particular field, is that if you were to take 5-time convicted violent offenders and basically sentence them to life or something akin to that, we could go into the difference between letting somebody out at 65 and keeping them in prison, because I don't think there's much of a difference. You just take them from, prison and let them go, and then they end up in a nursing home that's state-run, and whatever. They're just institutionalized. But, basically sentencing to life, a 5-time violent offender, and you would cut violent crime by 30%. Then you go 4 times and it goes to 40%, 3 times it goes to 50, 2 times and it goes to like 75, and 1 time it goes up to like 90%. Now, I'm of the opinion that our society really should be more merciful that a person gets convicted of a violent crime, because I don't know whether they're guilty or not, because I don't think the judicial system's that great at figuring that information out, and then we just throw them in prison for life. I think that's way too much. But you could convince me that pretty quickly and easily that somebody who's committed or been convicted, I should say, of 5 different violent crimes, that now you're talking to me as far as a 5 violent strikes, you're outlaw. Now, we know that there's been myriad problems with the 3 strikes, you're outlaw as it exists, because people will do little things and then get convicted, and then they're in prison for life for stealing a backpack or smoking weed or whatever the situation might be. But what do you think about a sort of 3 strikes rule on violent crime? And it could be 4 strikes or whatever.
Excellent question. I think part of it goes back to how the system's designed. We never really gave people a fair chance in the first place. And again, desperate people make desperate choices. Now, when you have a criminal that keeps committing crime, there are people out there that are hard to reach. I mean, just quite frank. Yep. And I won't say that anybody is impossible to reach. It's just that, do we have the resources? I mean, 80-ish% of those incarcerated, in my opinion, are worthy of redemption. They're worthy of change, and they can. You're going to have the ones that are broken. That's probably not the right word for it, but that are so damaged for whatever reason that happens to be, whether it's addictions or abuse or what have you, that you're just going to have a really hard time, reaching them. Now, those folks I found as a warden, they can actually turn into being a really productive person while they're incarcerated, because that's their life now. You tend to see lifers as being some of the best incarcerated people. because that prison's their home. It's their home for the rest of their lives. They don't want to live in dysfunction. They don't want to live in violence. They don't. They don't. And so those that have those types of sentences, I think, can actually somewhat be successful while incarcerated. Some of them are pretty dangerous to let out. I'm an operator. I'm not a mental health guy, so it's not necessarily my place. But personal experience, typically somebody who hits late 30s, early 40s, their chances of committing an additional crime have significantly reduced because the majority of them have outgrown those impulsive decisions as a kid. I'd say kid as being an older person now, but the teens, the 20s, maybe start of the 30s. Which is the majority of people that are incarcerated, when people mature out of that mindset and that crime set. So from personal experience, being a practitioner, again, I say this without being a mental health professional by any stretch, but they're just not a risk to society anymore. If you release the majority of these folks early, they're probably going to go home and take care of their kids and their grandkids, and they're probably going to get a job and be somewhat successful in society. So I think it's how do you measure that, though? If they're getting a very long sentence, nobody politically in their right mind is going to want to release them early, because if you do release that one person and they go out there and they rape somebody, they go out there and they kill somebody or significantly hurt somebody, that erases the whole program, because society backlash is going to be massive. So nobody's going to take a risk on those folks, when in all actuality, 90+% of them are going to do just fine in the free world.
Yeah, there was that situation where Michael Dukakis was drugged by the Bush campaign, somebody, about some guy, Willie Horton, maybe, some criminal in the past that, had gotten out in his state of Connecticut or whatever, and, done some kind of crime, whatever the situation, when his early release and committed a crime, and then somehow, it negatively affected his election chances. I'm going to ask one more question, but before you answer, I'm going to talk about salt lending. The question, so that you get a chance to think about it, is what advice do you have for my listeners, any of whom, on how to live their life more free? What's one piece of advice? I'll tell you about salt lending. If you've got cryptocurrency, salt lending allows you to take a collateralized loan against your cryptocurrency, completely tax-free, because there's no taxes on loans. I mean, you go to the bank, you get a loan, home equity line against your house. They don't tax you for it. It's because it's your money you're accessing. It's a business deal. And so if you want to access the money in your cryptocurrency, you don't want to sell cryptocurrency in order to access those funds. You want to be able to sell later when Bitcoin or whatever crypto you might have is higher. Well, salt lending's the one for you. And if you want to get a hold of salt lending, please email me at salt@markedge.org. That's SALT, salt@markedge.org. So, Brian, how can my listeners live a freer life?
Let me answer this maybe in a different way. I would imagine most of your listeners aren't the ones prone to committing crime to be going to prison. But what I would say is invest in better understanding the current systems within the United States. Understand how our judicial process works. And then if that frustrates you, find a way to engage. One thing I've been told, our number 2 largest funder of our nonprofit is Gideon Powell, huge Bitcoin supporter. He saw vision in our idea back when nobody saw it, because we were so disruptive and so unique. And he invested in us to make a difference in our society because of his interest in disrupting. Mental health is another passion of his, but disrupting how the United States operates its prison system. So, although it might not be, to answer your question, specific to them as a person, but we are the United States of America, the land of the free and the home of the brave, the country that I fought for and continue to fight for as a Marine. We're number 1 at very few things, but number 1 is incarcerating human beings. That's wrong. We are the United States. That should not be what we're number 1 in. And if you have the ability, the resources, the capability, invest in changing the system. Let's disrupt it. It doesn't work. Let's bring some freedom and some fairness and some compassion and some redemption to those who are incarcerated, or who those who are in the future are going to make those bad choices, and let's not throw away their life because of it. So although it's an indirect answer to your question, that's my thought.
Thank you. So if folks need to get a hold of you, Brian, what's the best way for them to contact you?
Our website, spcor.org.
spcor.org.
Correct. After the conference we were at together, Mark, we actually put a Bitcoin donation page on our website. Not something I'd considered before that, but love talking to Bitcoiners and yourself. And I was encouraged to to do that because Bitcoiners are a bit disruptive by nature as I've been educated. So that's the best way to get a hold of us.
Brian Koehn, thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mark. You're incredible.